شریف ایران، من شهریار افشار هستم، میزبان شما در برنامه پالیتیکس 365. امروز خانم دکتر کلی شنن به برنامه ما پیوسته از واشنگتن. ایشون یه نویسنده است و محقق و ریسرچر رایتر در چندین زمینه، مخصوصا حقوق بشر، حقوق زنان، ایران، خاورمیانه و روابط بین المللی در خاورمیانه. میخواستیم یه کتابی هم نوشته ایشون درباره human rights و نقش زنان در خاورمیانه که واقعا خیلی مهم بود، مخصوصا با توجه به تمام حوادثی که ما متاسفانه شاهدش هستیم، نه تنها در ایران، در خاورمیانه و افغانستان، اما واقعا در تمام دنیا. بقیه برنامه به انگلیسی هست، از اون لحاظ ما رو ببخشید. Kelly Shannon, welcome to our program. Thanks so much for joining us. Give us a quick background about your academic background, and then we'll get into your book. And then we want to ask you about your opinion about current events and what's to come.
Great, thank you for having me. I'm currently a national fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University this year, but I'm also an associate professor of history at Florida Atlantic University in South Florida. I am a historian of U.S. foreign relations with a particular focus on Iran, the broader Islamic world, and women's human rights. So my first book was about how the issue of women's human rights became a policy issue for the United States regarding Muslim majority countries. And it's not exclusively about Iran, but Iran plays a big role in that book, especially the 1979 revolution and the rolling back of women's rights in that country. And I deal with a lot of other countries in that book as well, including Afghanistan. And then I'm currently working on a book on the foundations of the U.S. relationship with Iran. So it's a history of U.S.-Iran relations in the first half of the 20th century, from the Constitutional Revolution through the 28 Mordad coup. But I'm looking not just at state-to-state relations. I'm looking at cultural perceptions, cultural exchange, non-state actors, all of the different levels of engagement that Americans and Iranians had in that period, and how that laid the foundation for the relationship that came after. So thank you for having me.
Thank you for your research. I love it when I see, someone that wasn't, I assume you weren't born in Iran, but
No.
I love it when global thinkers focus on Iran and do research. It helps to have kind of I don't want to say outside, but a different perspective than just the internal perspective. Because we speak a lot to a lot of Iranian academics that spent their lives. It's kind of an easy thing, right? You're Iranian and you spent, but for you to do it, I think my hat's off to you. And thank you for what you're doing. I really can't think of a more important topic. We've always said in this program, women's rights are human rights. So you really shouldn't separate the two. And I want to get into the thesis of your book in a minute. But one thing I've always noticed about American foreign policy, especially when we look at the Middle East and all the autocratic regimes that suppress women and their citizens, is that U.S. foreign policy seems ineffective in changing that behavior. So I would love for you to comment on that and what do you think would be effective. We as a democracy, of course, want to see the same type of, I don't say American democracy, but the same type of openness and freedom that we have in this country, we enjoy in this country, in other countries. But it's really hard to watch when you watch Iran, Afghanistan, other countries in the Middle East treat their women as second-class citizens, not to mention the mutilations and the assaults and all the other things that are horrific events. So before we get to your book, maybe if you want to comment on that, do you feel foreign policy can be effective? Is it a long-term play? Are we playing chess and they're playing checkers, or the other way around? It seems like we're not doing it right. It just seems like.
Yeah, I've grappled with this, and I do this in my book to some extent, where I think that the U.S., part of the problem is that the United States has a different set of people setting policy every 4 to 8 years. And so I've seen that really it was the Bill Clinton administration who first tried to mainstream women's rights as a policy issue, not just in terms of foreign policy, but also across domestic policy in the executive branch. And regarding non-Western countries, I think there was this understanding that having the United States force ideas on countries and have it be a top-down imposition of what are seen as Western ideas is not an effective approach. And so they actually worked really closely with activists from countries around the world, women from these countries, especially the Middle East, allowed them to set the agenda, say what they needed, and then give them the resources to do the work that they needed. And so the US kind of took a back seat in some ways. And I saw this as far more effective than later administrations' approaches. So, for instance, the George W. Bush administration paired its women's rights policies with an invasion in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I mean, that just automatically makes resisting women's equality a way of resisting the US occupation and invasion. And so that's really not helpful. And they tended to adopt this rescue narrative that these Afghan women needed to be rescued by the West. And that's also really not helpful. And it overlooks the work that Afghan women have been doing on the ground for a very long time. And Afghan feminists were saying, "Don't invade. War is always bad for women." And obviously, the U.S. didn't listen. Since then, I really, I don't think there's been much commitment by the United States government to women's rights concerns. I mean, there was when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State under Obama. After she was no longer in that position, the rest of the Obama administration's support for women's rights abroad was fairly tepid. The Trump administration was disastrous. I mean, he completely rolled back all of the new institutions that had been created in the State Department and other areas of governance regarding women's rights in foreign policy. We know the Trump administration was not feminist, right? And then the Biden administration, they've made some noise about supporting women's rights abroad, but I haven't seen any evidence that they really are putting a lot of resources behind it. And quite frankly, the way that they withdrew from Afghanistan is what allowed for the Taliban to come back to power. That was badly handled, and I think they completely abandoned Afghan women and the allies that had worked hard to collaborate with the United States during the 20 years of occupation, and just kind of threw them to the wolves. And so that could have been handled much better, creating this government that's largely dependent on the US presence and then leaving suddenly just pulled the rug out from under them. And Afghan women are the ones to suffer. So I think, what I found in my research is really it was the public and it was international NGOs, feminist activists putting pressure on the US government, on the United Nations, and then building alliances with people in policy positions, especially in the Clinton administration, who got women's rights on the agenda in the first place. And I think it's going to take public pressure now to get women's human rights back front and center. But that's difficult in our current age where everybody's attention is scattered and
Right.
it's, the news cycle is constantly diverting attention from important issues and everybody
Right.
hates each other.
Everybody, yeah, and that may not change.
Right.
I don't know if it's going to be better, but as I look at the big picture and to that point of what is the U.S. doing for women's rights in the Middle East, it seems like to me, and I could be wrong, it's just an observation by a non-professional, is that either they throw some sanctions at a country or they make some statements. I'm outraged, some press release, and I couldn't support this more. They appoint women to various high foreign policy roles. So they project our culture, our American culture abroad by putting maybe even minority women in foreign policy roles, as we've seen, which is great. Iran, by the way, used to do that, as you may know, prior
Yes.
to 1979. A
Yes.
lot of ambassadors, they were the source of great pride. They still are back then. And it's just so, like you say, it shows how we've gone back. Seems like 1,000 years. So politics is like that, right? People throw these, they make statements. I can't believe it. That they maybe appoint a person, and by appointing that person, they're making a statement. They're making, the Saudis or countries shake hands or being, listen to women for a change, which is great. I love it when I see those scenes globally. I hope to see it one day in Iran. So, tell us a little bit about your book, and then I want to turn to current events because like you say, there's so much going. Everyone hates each other. It's terrible time. It's terrible time to explain foreign policy to your kids. When you see the events happening in Gaza, all the different countries that are in various stages of upheaval, and obviously Iran's influence, unfortunately, in the region, instead of being a force of good, they're a force of, destruction and division. So tell us if there's more to say about your book. Let's talk about your book, and let me just make sure I get the name right. And I assume it's on Amazon.
Yes.
Okay, so it's U.S. Foreign Policy and Muslim Women's Human Rights by Kelly Shannon. It's on Amazon. Kelly J. Shannon, unless there's another Kelly Shannon. I don't
There,
know.
yeah, there is
There
actually.
is
She's in
another.
like
Okay,
urban
there
planning,
is
but
another
yeah.
Shahryar Afshar too, by the way. I don't know
Okay.
about your doppelganger, but my Shahryar Afshar is a world-renowned physicist from Harvard, one of the
Ah,
smartest people. So very, very different from me.
yeah.
And every time you Google Shahryar Afshar, you get his face, and sometimes they mix us up. It's like my face and his name. Uh, but we
Yeah.
digress.
Yeah,
Uh,
mine's in urban planning and has published a bunch of articles. So I use my
okay.
middle initial. Yeah.
Not so bad, not so
Yeah.
controversial. Okay, so again, U.S. Foreign Policy and Muslim Women's Human Rights by Kelly J. Shannon. It's on Amazon. Go check it out. So tell us a little bit about your the thesis again, and then we'll go to current events.
Okay, yeah. So I started it with George W. Bush in 2001 calling for the liberation of Afghan women. And that was weird, right? That was
Yeah.
not traditionally a US war goal. The Bush administration was not a feminist organization. It had adopted certain rights for women, but it was certainly at odds with a lot of American feminist organizations at the time. So I wanted to see where that came from. And I found that it was really kind of a confluence of events where the American public, which long had these stereotypes about Muslim women as these silent veiled victims or maybe belly dancers or something, started changing how they were looking at women in the rest of the world as a result of the civil rights and feminist movements happening in the United States in the 60s and 70s. At the same time, there was the global human rights movement that really kind of burst onto the scene in the 1970s. And it creates a condition where the American public are primed to look at the situation of women in countries like Iran in a different way. But of course, we know Iranian women had a very different situation before 1979. But when the 79 revolution happens, Americans were really struck by the almost immediate rolling back of the gains that women had made over the previous century or so in Iran. And so this really captures American public attention. They start to understand the situation through the lens of women's human rights in particular. And there's this really sustained conversation that starts happening in the United States that maybe women in the Islamic world need help. Maybe they're tied to the fight for women's rights at home. But it takes feminist activists, especially NGOs, to make this a policy issue. And one of my key actors is actually Manaz Afkhami, who was the Minister of State for Women's Affairs under the Shah. Who's exiled to the United States and becomes a major player in the international feminist space and the policymaking space over the course of especially the 1990s and since. And she's still today very active, very impressive. And so, these feminists start lobbying the United Nations. They start lobbying the United States. They don't succeed at first with the United States government, but when the Clinton administration is elected, they now have an administration with sympathy towards feminist goals, and especially with the First Lady and then eventually the appointment of Madeleine Albright, you have feminists in very high-ranking positions. So this provides an in for these feminist activists. And so this kind of coming together of these the public discourse, the feminist activism, and then these sympathetic policymakers leads to what I see as the first real foreign policy decision that's driven by women's rights concerns, and that's the non-recognition of the Taliban when they take power the first time in 1996. And there's a lot of behind the scenes stuff that happens that I trace in the book, but that's kind of the climax of the book. And then my last chapter traces the legacy of that and how the Bush administration took that precedent, but approached it in a more kind of colonial way than the Clinton people had done. And honestly, I wrote that book with the expectation that the 2016 election would have gone very differently. And I think we'd have a very different foreign policy right now regarding women's rights. But here we are. Yeah, so
Is
that's.
it an actual policy? Or like that, because sometimes when politicians like presidents make
Mhm.
statements, okay, State Department, puts it down on their to-do list. Maybe they mention it, but I don't know if people really understand if there's action behind it, like,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. So it was definitely a policy under the Clinton administration. It wasn't just action. They created new institutions in the executive branch and the State Department. There's actually, I trace a power struggle between the Afghan desk and the new Office of International Women's Issues in the Clinton administration, and the Office of International Women's Issues wins. And so you get the US not only not recognizing the Taliban, but becoming the major world donor to development, not just for the Afghan people, but especially for Afghan women. And a lot of that goes through NGOs on the ground. But they literally put their money where their mouth was. They were working with NGOs globally. As I said, there were sort of these NGOs would work with the policymakers to set the agenda, to decide what was needed and what would be most helpful from the US side of things. And so there was a lot of back and forth. It wasn't just power flowing one way. With the Bush people, it was a policy too. It was mainstreamed all the way through, even the military units that were going to Afghanistan. They had some similar policies in Iraq, and this, was included building women's hospitals, for instance, pushing for women's education. But again, it was paired with a war, which is not good for women and children. So that, there was significant action taken by those administrations. And then there was, again, when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State under Obama, but really the action has died down a lot since then.
Right. So there was funding behind it. And
there was funding,
really
there was personnel.
Right.
Yeah.
That's how that's how the State Department takes action, is they get funding to build institutions. So hopefully other countries can be propped up and maintain themselves for the extent possible. So in the couple of minutes we have left, so much is going on currently in the Middle East that I think is dismaying. I don't know, like you say, even any war that happens, especially the loss of life in Gaza, the tremendous loss of life, and of course October 7th, unthinkable events against the Israeli people. It's really hard to watch as Americans, and whether it's children or women, they get the worst of it. There's just no way to sugarcoat it. They get the worst of it on both sides. There was a tremendous, as we all of us sadly witnessed or became aware of, sexual violence against women by the terrorist group Hamas on October 7th, and God knows what they're doing to the hostages that they're still holding on to. And then on the other side, the collateral damage is just devastating to watch. And you only see, apart from dads, you only see, moms and children crying in the streets. It's just devastating. How do you build on something? And I know it's a really tough question, but how do you build, how do you recover from that? And how do you help women in an environment where even caregivers and NGOs are getting bombed? Do you just stand back until the dust settles, or how do you deal with that? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, from the average person's perspective, you do feel really helpless. It's really the policymakers, the U.S. government, the Israeli government, the world community, who are going to have to put pressure on the Israelis to stop the fighting somehow. And I know that Hamas is involved in this, but I think there was a really good article written by Jonathan Panikoff at the Atlantic Council recently that makes a case for trying to get both sides to see that it's in their pragmatic interests to stop the fighting and to actually try to solve this longstanding conflict between Israel and Palestine. But in the meantime, I think the best thing Americans can do is to keep putting pressure on the Biden administration to be more emphatic with Israel and trying to get them to rein back the violence, because no rebuilding can happen until the fighting stops, until the bombs stop. And, just trying to get food to people. We've seen you can't even get humanitarian aid in without the aid workers coming under fire. So this is, I think, a situation that is unprecedented in a lot of ways, and it's really difficult to wrap our heads around as people watching from far away.
Right. Thank you so much. Kelly J. Shannon, author of U.S. Foreign Policy and Muslim Women's Human Rights. It's on Amazon. Go check it out. Please come back and join us soon. I really enjoyed our talk. It's such important work that you're doing. Keep at it. Keep going. We need more insight, more knowledge about this topic, and the more people study women's rights and human rights in the Middle East, the better. So thank you so much for what you're doing.
Great. Thanks for having me, and I'd love to come back.
Thank you.